When Captain Thomas Blackwood died in the storm that claimed his ship, his wife Eleanor thought she knew everything about the man she had loved for 30 years. She was wrong. 3 months after the funeral, while clearing out their cottage, a loose floorboard revealed a secret that would change everything. Buried beneath their home lay an ornate pirate chest, its brass fittings green with age. Eleanor expected treasure, perhaps gold coins or precious stones that might ease her financial worries. Instead, she found something far more valuable and infinitely more heartbreaking. 200 letters, each one carefully preserved, each one written by a dead sailor to a family that would never receive it. Messages of love from fathers to children, apologies from sons to mothers, final words from husbands to wives. But why did Thomas have them, and what dark secret connected her gentle husband to these lost souls? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted the first letter from the chest. The parchment was yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear, written in a careful hand that spoke of education and tenderness. She unfolded it slowly, afraid it might crumble at her touch. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have not returned home as promised. I pray these words find you grown into the beautiful young woman I know you will become." The letter was signed "Your loving father, William Hartwell," and dated 43 years ago. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she continued reading. William wrote of his love for his daughter, of dreams he had for her future, of the small wooden doll he had carved for her birthday that he hoped she would treasure. He spoke of the sea and its dangers, of his fear that he might never hold her again, of his regret at leaving when she was only 5 years old. Eleanor set the letter down, her vision blurred with tears. This was not just old correspondence. This was a father's final words to his child, words that had never reached their destination. She looked back at the chest, seeing it now not as a container of mysteries, but as a repository of broken hearts and unfulfilled promise. The weight of what she had discovered settled heavily on her shoulders. Each letter represented a life cut short, a family left wondering, a story that ended without proper conclusion. William's daughter Sarah would now be nearly 50 years old, if she was still alive. Had she spent decades wondering what happened to her father? Had she given up hope, or did some part of her still wait for his return? Eleanor picked up another letter, this one addressed to "My beloved wife Martha." The handwriting was different, shakier, as if written in haste or under duress. The man signed himself as John Whitmore, and his words spoke of eternal love and promises to find his way home. He mentioned their wedding day, the cottage they had planned to buy, the children they hoped to have together. As she read letter after letter, a pattern emerged. These were not random pieces of correspondence. They were final messages, written by men who somehow knew they might not survive their journey. But how had Thomas come to possess them? Her gentle husband, who spent his days tending their small garden and reading by the fireplace, who never spoke of adventure or danger, who seemed to have no past before the day they met. The cottage around her seemed different now, as if Thomas's secret had changed the very walls that sheltered her. She had lived here for 30 years, believing she knew every corner, every creak of the floorboards, every story these rooms could tell. Now she wondered what other secrets lay hidden, what other truths Thomas had kept from her. That evening, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with the letters spread before her like pieces of an impossible puzzle. Each one told a fragment of a larger story, a tragedy that had claimed multiple lives and somehow spared her husband. As darkness fell outside, she made a decision that would change the course of her remaining years. Tomorrow she would begin the search for Sarah Hartwell. Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her footsteps echoing in the cramped space above their bedroom. She had avoided this place since Thomas's death, unable to face the accumulated memories of their shared life. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through a small window, and the air smelled of old wood and forgotten time. Boxes lined the walls, each one labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting. Christmas decorations, Eleanor's books, wedding photos. But now she searched for something else, something that might explain the chest and its tragic contents. Her eyes fell on a box she had never noticed before, pushed far into a corner and covered with an old tarpaulin. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, she found a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth, fine handling, and the pages inside were filled with Thomas's handwriting, though younger and less steady than the script she knew. Her hands shook as she read the first entry, dated 43 years ago. "I am the only one left," it began. "The screams have finally stopped, and the ocean has claimed them all. Captain Morrison, brave John Whitmore, young William with his dreams of home. The pirates showed no mercy. I should have died with them, but God has cursed me with survival." Eleanor sank onto an old trunk, the journal heavy in her hands. Thomas had never spoken of his life before they met. She had assumed he was simply a private man, that his past held nothing more interesting than the ordinary struggles of youth. She had been wrong about so much. The entries continued, painting a picture of horror that explained everything. Thomas had been a crew member aboard the merchant vessel, Mercy's Dream, bound for the Caribbean with a cargo of trade goods and high hopes for profit. They had been attacked by pirates 3 days out from port. Most of the crew had been killed outright. Others, wounded and dying, had pressed their final letters into Thomas's hands as the ship burned around them. "William gave me his letter as he bled out on the deck," Thomas had written. "He made me promise to find his daughter, to tell her he loved her. They all did the same. Dying men, begging me to carry their words home. I took the letters and jumped overboard as the ship went down. I floated on debris for 2 days before a fishing boat found me." But Thomas had never delivered the letters. Entry after entry revealed his struggle with survivor's guilt, his inability to face the families of the dead, his shame at being alive when better men had perished. He had moved far from the coast, changed his name, tried to forget, but the letters had followed him, a burden he carried for 4 decades. "I cannot bear to see the hope in their eyes turn to grief," he had written. "I cannot be the messenger of death to children, waiting for fathers who will never return. I am a coward, and God will judge me for it." Eleanor closed the journal, understanding finally washing over her. Thomas had spent their entire marriage carrying the weight of 200 undelivered messages. No wonder he sometimes seemed distant, lost in thoughts he could never share. No wonder he startled at unexpected sounds, why he insisted on checking the doors twice before bed. He had been haunted by ghosts she could never see. The attic felt smaller now, crowded with the presence of truth. Eleanor looked around at the other boxes, wondering what other secrets they might hold, but she had found what she needed. The journal explained everything: the chest, the letters, and the quiet sadness that had sometimes shadowed Thomas's eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She descended the stairs slowly, the journal clutched to her chest. In the kitchen, she set it beside William's letter and stared at both documents. Thomas had been unable to complete his promise to the dying sailors, but perhaps she could. Perhaps it was not too late to deliver these final messages, to bring closure to families who had waited decades for word of their loved ones. The telephone directory sat on the shelf beside the kitchen window. Eleanor pulled it down and opened to the H section, running her finger down the column until she found what she was looking for. There in small print, Hartwell S., 1247 Maple Street. Sarah Hartwell still lived in the same town where her father had left her 43 years ago. The lighthouse stood like a weathered sentinel against the grey morning sky, its white paint peeling from decades of salt spray and storms. Eleanor had driven 2 hours to reach this remote stretch of coastline, following directions she had found in Thomas's journal. He had mentioned the lighthouse keeper who had helped him after his rescue, a man named Ezra Blackstone, who had given him shelter and asked no questions about his past. Eleanor climbed the rocky path to the keeper's cottage, her coat whipping in the coastal wind. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a man in his 80s with eyes the color of storm clouds and hands gnarled by a lifetime of maritime work. "You'll be Eleanor Blackwood," he said, as if he had been expecting her for years. "Thomas's wife. I can see him in your face, the way you hold yourself when the wind blows. Mr. Blackstone, you knew my husband? Knew him? Child, I pulled him from death's door 43 years ago. Come in before this wind carries you off to sea." The cottage interior was warm and cluttered with the accumulated treasures of a man who had spent his life watching over sailors. Ship models lined the shelves and maritime charts covered the walls. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden desk, its surface scarred by decades of use. "Sit," Ezra commanded, pulling out a chair. "I'll make tea, and then you can tell me why you've come looking for ghosts." As the old man busied himself with kettle and cups, Eleanor studied the lighthouse logbooks stacked on his desk. Each volume was filled with careful entries recording weather conditions, ship sightings, and rescue operations. She could see Ezra's handwriting evolving over the years, growing more shaky with age, but never losing its precision. "He was barely alive when the fishing boat brought him in," Ezra said, setting a steaming cup before her. "Hypothermia, exposure, trauma," kept babbling about letters and promises he couldn't keep. "I thought it was delirium at first, but it wasn't. No, it wasn't. When he recovered enough to talk sensibly, he told me about the Mercy's dream. I remembered that ship, logged her passage 3 days before. Never saw her return." Ezra pulled one of the older logbooks from the stack and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. There, in his younger handwriting, Eleanor read the entry that confirmed everything Thomas had written in his journal. June 15, 1980. Fishing vessel Molly's Pride brought in survivor from merchant ship Mercy's Dream. Ship reported attack by pirates. All hands lost except Thomas Blackwood, age 20. Survivor, in poor condition, carrying personal effects of deceased crew members. Ship's manifest indicates 23 souls aboard. 1 survivor. Eleanor traced the words with her finger, feeling the weight of history in the careful script. 23 men had sailed on the Mercy's Dream. Only Thomas had returned. "I kept him here for 2 months while he recovered," Ezra continued. "Strong young man, but broken inside. He'd wake up screaming about the letters, about promises he'd made to dying men. I told him he needed to deliver those messages, that the families deserved to know what happened to their loved ones, but he never did. No, the guilt was eating him alive, but so was his fear. He'd seen what grief could do to people, watched it destroy his own mother when his father was lost at sea. He couldn't bear to be the one to bring that pain to other families." Ezra turned to another page in the logbook, this one containing a list of names. Eleanor recognized several from the letters she had read. William Hartwell, John Whitmore, Captain Morrison. "I tried to convince him that not knowing was worse than knowing," Ezra said, "but he was young and traumatized. One morning I woke up and he was gone. Left a note saying he couldn't face what he had to do, that he was going inland where the sea couldn't follow him." "Did you ever hear from him again?" "Christmas cards every year for 43 years. No return address, just signed Tom. I knew he'd changed his name, started over somewhere. I hoped he'd found peace, but I always wondered about those letters." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out William's letter, placing it on the desk between them. Ezra's weathered face softened as he recognized the familiar handwriting. "So he kept them all this time, hidden under our floorboards. I only found them after he died. And now you want to finish what he started." "I have to. They've waited long enough." Ezra nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for further words. He pulled out a modern telephone directory and began copying addresses onto a sheet of paper. "I've kept track of some of the families over the years," he said. "Old habit from lighthouse keeping. You never stop watching out for lost souls trying to find their way home." The address led Eleanor to a small cottage surrounded by rose bushes, their autumn blooms adding splashes of color to the gray October day. Sarah Hartwell's home sat at the end of a quiet street, with lace curtains in the windows and a wooden sign by the door reading Hartwell House. Eleanor recognized the year as the one when William would have returned from his final voyage. If he had survived, she knocked gently, her heart pounding as footsteps approached from inside. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded Eleanor immediately of the careful handwriting in William's letter. Sarah had her father's gentle features and the same artistic hands that had crafted his loving words. Sarah Hartwell, yes, that's me. Can I help you? Eleanor struggled to find the right words. How do you tell someone that their father's final message has been waiting 43 years to reach them? My name is Eleanor Blackwood. I have something that belonged to your father, William Hartwell. Something I think you should have. Sarah's face paled, and she gripped the door frame for support. My father? But he's been gone for so long. How could you possibly have something of his? May I come in? It's a long story, and you might want to sit down. Sarah led her into a living room that felt like stepping back in time. The furniture was well maintained, but clearly from decades past, and the walls were covered with maritime paintings and photographs of ships. On the mantelpiece sat a small wooden doll, its paint faded, but features still clear. Eleanor's breath caught. Is that the doll your father carved for you? Sarah turned to look at the cherished object, tears already forming in her eyes. How did you know about that? I was 5 when he left for his last voyage. He promised to bring me back something special, but he never returned. I found this doll in his workshop after we realized he wasn't coming home. He wrote about it, Eleanor said softly, pulling William's letter from her purse. He wrote about you. With trembling hands, Sarah took the letter and unfolded it carefully. Eleanor watched as 43 years of wondering and waiting came to an end in a single moment. Sarah's lips moved silently as she read her father's words, tears streaming down her cheeks. He loved me, she whispered. I always hoped, but I was so young when he left. Sometimes I wondered if I had just imagined how much he cared. He thought about you every day he was at sea. He wrote this letter because he was afraid he might not make it home, and he wanted you to know how proud he was of you. Sarah read the letter again, slowly this time, absorbing every word. When she finished, she looked up at Eleanor with eyes full of gratitude and pain. How do you have this? What happened to my father? Eleanor told her about Thomas, about the pirate attack, about the dying sailors who had pressed their final messages into the hands of the only survivor. She explained how Thomas had carried the guilt for 4 decades, unable to deliver the letters, but unable to destroy them. So my father died trying to come home to me. Sarah said, I always feared he might have abandoned us, that the sea had offered him something better than his life here. He was coming home, Sarah. The letter makes that clear. He was excited about your birthday, about teaching you to read the maps he used for navigation. He had plans for your future together. Sarah stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a thick photo album. She opened it to the first page, revealing pictures of a young William Hartwell with his wife and infant daughter. This is all I have left of him, she said. Mama died 10 years ago, and she never remarried. She said she was still married to a man who was lost at sea, and that was enough for her. Eleanor studied the photographs, seeing the same gentle features in the young father that had marked his daughter. William had been barely 30 when he died, younger than Sarah was now. I named my son William, Sarah continued, and my grandson carries the name too. I wanted to keep something of my father alive in the world. He would be so proud of the woman you became, Eleanor said, and so grateful that his name lives on. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Sarah pressed something into her hand. It was a small key, old and tarnished. This was his, Sarah explained. The only thing he left behind, besides the doll. I never knew what it opened, but I kept it all these years. Maybe it belongs with the other letters, with the story of what really happened to him. Eleanor accepted the key, understanding that she held another piece of the puzzle that had been Thomas's burden and was now becoming her mission. Martha Whitmore lived in a boarding house that had seen better days, its Victorian facade crumbling but dignified in the way of old women who refused to surrender to time. Eleanor found her in the communal garden, tending to a small plot of vegetables, with the careful attention of someone who understood that nurturing life was a form of prayer. At 78, Martha moved with the deliberate grace of advanced age, her white hair pinned back with silver combs that caught the afternoon light. She wore her late husband's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, the gold band worn smooth by decades of touching. "Mrs. Whitmore? Martha Whitmore?" The elderly woman looked up from her tomato plants, her blue eyes still sharp despite her years. "I haven't been called that in so long, I almost forgot to answer. Most folks here just call me Martha. What can I do for you, dear?" Eleanor introduced herself carefully, watching Martha's face for signs of distress as she explained about the letters. But Martha listened with a composure that spoke of someone who had long ago made peace with grief. "John Whitmore was my husband," Martha said when Eleanor finished. "Lost at sea 43 years ago this December. I knew he was gone before anyone told me. Felt it in my bones the night it happened." She led Eleanor to a weathered bench beneath an apple tree, its branches heavy with late-season fruit. The garden around them buzzed with the quiet activity of other residents, elderly people finding purpose in small daily rituals. "You say you have a letter from him." Eleanor pulled out John's message, noting how Martha's hands trembled slightly as she accepted it. The envelope was addressed in John's careful script. "To my beloved wife Martha, if God wills that I should not return." He always was dramatic, Martha said with a sad smile, but her voice carried deep affection. "Used to leave me little notes in my apron pocket when he went to work at the docks. 'Good morning, my darling,' or 'Don't forget you're beautiful.' Silly romantic things that made me blush even after 5 years of marriage." She opened the letter slowly, her weathered fingers treating the paper like precious silk. Eleanor watched as Martha read her husband's final words, seeing decades of loneliness and wondering come to an end in a single moment. "He says he dreamed about our cottage," Martha whispered, "about the yellow roses I planted by the front door, about the children we planned to have. He says if he doesn't come home I should find love again, should not waste my life waiting for a ghost. But you never remarried." Martha looked up from the letter, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "How could I? He was the other half of my soul. When he died, that part of me died too. I moved here 20 years ago when I could no longer afford our cottage. The new owners tore down the roses." She folded the letter carefully and held it against her heart. "But I want you to know I did live. I became a teacher, helped raise other people's children since I couldn't have my own. I traveled when I had the money, read every book I could find, learned to paint watercolors. I didn't waste my life, even if I spent it alone." Eleanor felt the weight of 43 years of solitary devotion, understanding that Martha's faithfulness to her lost husband was both heartbreaking and beautiful. This woman had chosen love over convenience, memory over moving on. "I kept our wedding ring," Martha continued, touching the chain at her neck. "Wore it every day until arthritis made it too painful, but I couldn't bear to put it away completely. John gave it to me on our wedding day and said it was a promise that nothing could separate us, not even death." She opened the letter again and read aloud, "Martha, my darling, I want you to know that whatever happens to me, I will find a way back to you. If not in this life, then in whatever comes after. Look for me in the sunset over the water, in the first roses of spring, in the laughter of children playing. I will be there, loving you always." "He kept his promise," Martha said softly. "I found him in all those places, just like he said, and now I have his words to prove it wasn't just my imagination." As Eleanor prepared to leave, Martha pressed something into her hand. It was a small silver locket containing a photograph of John in his merchant marine uniform. "I have dozens of pictures," Martha explained, "but this one belongs with his letter. Someone should know what he looked like when he wrote those words. Should remember that he was more than just a name on a list of the dead. The Maritime Historical Society occupied a converted warehouse near the old harbour district, its brick walls lined with ship models, navigation instruments and portraits of long-dead sea captains. Eleanor had come seeking official records of the Mercy's Dream, hoping to understand more about the ship that had carried her husband and 22 other men to their fate. Patricia Hayes, the Society's chief archivist, was a woman in her 60s with the sharp eyes of someone who spent her life piecing together historical puzzles. She led Eleanor through rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes, the air thick with the smell of old paper and preservation chemicals. The Mercy's Dream, Dr. Hayes mused, pulling a thick folder from a cabinet marked Merchant Vessels 1970-1985. I remember this case. One of the last documented pirate attacks in these waters. The authorities never found the ship or recovered any bodies. She spread the contents of the folder across a research table. Eleanor saw official documents, newspaper clippings, and maritime insurance claims. At the center of it all lay a detailed cargo manifest, listing everything the ship had carried on its final voyage. "This is fascinating," Hayes said, studying the manifest with professional interest. Most merchant vessels of that era carried simple trade goods, textiles, tools, basic supplies, but the Mercy's Dream was different. Eleanor leaned closer to examine the list. Alongside entries for bolts of cloth and barrels of flour, she saw more personal items. Family Bible, property of W. Hartwell, wedding ring set, property of J. Whitmore, medical instruments, property of Dr. R. Morrison. They were carrying their personal belongings, Eleanor realized. These weren't just sailors on a short voyage. They were moving their lives. Exactly. This was what we call a settlement voyage. The crew members weren't just working passage. They were emigrating, planning to establish new homes in the Caribbean, start fresh lives with their families. Hayes pulled out another document, a letter of intent signed by the ship's captain. Captain Morrison had purchased land in Barbados. He was planning to retire there, bring his wife and children once he'd established a homestead. Eleanor thought of the letters she had read, understanding now why so many of them spoke of dreams and future plans. These men hadn't been simply working a job. They had been chasing new beginnings, carrying everything they owned toward a promised land they would never reach. The pirates took everything, Dr. Hayes continued, consulting police reports from the investigation, stripped the ship completely before sinking it. The personal belongings of 23 families gone without a trace. Not everything, Eleanor said quietly. The letters survived. She told Dr. Hayes about Thomas, about the chest hidden beneath their floorboards, about the messages that had waited 4 decades to reach their destinations. The Archegos listened with growing excitement, understanding the historical significance of what Eleanor had discovered. These letters would be invaluable for understanding the human cost of maritime crime, Dr. Hayes said. But more than that, their primary source documents about the hopes and dreams of ordinary people seeking better lives. They deserve to be preserved. From another box, Dr. Hayes pulled out a photograph of the Mercy's Dream, showing a sturdy 3-masted vessel with white sails and brass fittings. She was a beautiful ship, built in 1962, designed for both cargo and passenger service. The owners advertised her as a bridge to new beginnings. Eleanor stared at the photograph, imagining Thomas as a young man standing on that deck, watching the horizon with hope, rather than dread. Before the attack, before the guilt, before the 40 years of carrying other men's secrets. "There's something else you should see," Hayes said, producing a thin folder marked Survivor Accounts. Inside was a single page, an official statement given to authorities by Thomas Blackwood shortly after his rescue. Eleanor read her husband's words, typed on official letterhead, and signed in his young handwriting. The statement was brief and clinical, describing the attack in terms of time and location, wind conditions and water temperature. It mentioned the letters only in passing. Deceased crew members entrusted personal correspondence to declarant before expiry. He gave this statement and then disappeared, Dr. Hayes explained. The authorities tried to follow up with him for the official inquiry, but he'd vanished, changed his name, moved inland. The case was eventually closed without his testimony. He couldn't face it, Eleanor said, understanding her husband's flight from responsibility. He was just a boy, traumatized and alone. Dr. Hayes closed the file gently. Sometimes the greatest courage comes not from facing our fears immediately, but from carrying them until we're strong enough to act. Your husband carried those letters for 40 years. Now you're finishing what he started. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes handed her a business card. When you've delivered all the letters, please consider donating them to our collection. These voices deserve to be remembered, and their families' stories need to be told. In the basement archives of the county courthouse, Eleanor discovered a confession that changed everything she thought she knew about the attack on the Mercy's Dream. The letter had been filed with the effects of Captain James Redbeard Morrison, executed 3 years after the attack for crimes of piracy and murder. The confession was written in an educated hand that surprised Eleanor. She had expected the crude scrawl of a brutal criminal, not the careful script of someone who understood the weight of written words. To whoever finds this letter, it began, I write these words on the eve of my execution, hoping to make peace with God and the families I have wronged. My name is Captain James Morrison, and I am responsible for the deaths of 22 innocent men aboard the merchant vessel Mercy's Dream. Eleanor read with growing astonishment as the pirate captain described the attack in detail. What struck her most was his obvious remorse and his specific mention of Thomas. Among the crew was a young man named Thomas Blackwood, barely more than a boy. I watched him jump overboard as our ship burned around him. I could have ordered my men to pursue him, to ensure no witnesses survived. Instead, I let him go. Perhaps it was cowardice, or perhaps God stayed my hand. I pray that boy found his way to safety and made something good of the life I spared. The letter went on to describe Captain Morrison's growing guilt over the years that followed, his eventual capture, and his desire to make amends for his crimes. But it was his final paragraph that took Eleanor's breath away. I kept one thing from that cursed ship, a bundle of letters the dying sailors pressed into each other's hands. I meant to burn them with everything else, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the last decent impulse in my black heart. I hid them in a chest and buried it near the lighthouse at Beacon Point. If anyone finds this confession, please know that those letters contain the final words of good men who deserved better than they received from me. Eleanor's hands shook as she realized the truth. The pirates hadn't taken the letters. Thomas hadn't been carrying them when he escaped. Captain Morrison had hidden them himself, and somehow Thomas had found them later, perhaps while recovering at the lighthouse. She thought of Ezra Blackstone, the lighthouse keeper who had cared for Thomas after his rescue. Had the old man known about the buried chest? Had he helped Thomas find it, understanding that the young survivor needed to carry something more than just his own grief? The confession changed everything Eleanor thought she understood about her husband's burden. Thomas hadn't just been carrying the letters out of survivor's guilt. He had been carrying them because he had chosen to seek them out, to take responsibility for promises he hadn't even made. Robert Morrison lived in a modest apartment above his auto repair shop, the smell of motor oil and metal shavings permeating the air. At 43, he bore a striking resemblance to the photograph Eleanor had seen of his father, Captain Morrison of the Mercy's Dream. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same calloused hands that spoke of honest work. Eleanor had found him through employment records, tracking down the son whose existence was mentioned in one of the most heartbreaking letters she had discovered. Captain Morrison had written to his pregnant wife about the child he would never meet, expressing hopes and dreams for a son who would grow up without knowing his father's face. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood," she began as Robert wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I have something that belonged to your father, Robert's expression darkened. "Ma'am, if you're here about my father's debts or legal troubles, I can't help you. He died before I was born, and my mother never told me much about him, except that he was a sailor who didn't come home." "It's nothing like that," Eleanor assured him. "I have a letter he wrote to you before you were born. A letter expressing how much he loved you, even though he never got to meet you." Robert set down his tools, his skepticism evident. "That's impossible. My mother said he abandoned us, that he went to sea and never looked back. She died 5 years ago, without ever mentioning any letter." Eleanor pulled out the carefully preserved document, noting how Robert's hands trembled as he accepted it. The envelope was addressed in Captain Morrison's careful script. "To my unborn child, may you know how much your father loves you." As Robert read, Eleanor watched 43 years of assumed abandonment crumble away. The letter spoke of a father's excitement about his coming child, of plans to teach his son about navigation and the stars, of dreams of building a better life for his family through honest work at sea. "He wanted to name me Robert," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "after his own father. My mother never told me that. She just said she picked the name because she liked it." The letter continued with Captain Morrison's hopes for his son's future, his wish that the boy would grow up to be a better man than his father, his promise to return home as soon as possible to hold his child. There was no mention of abandonment, no suggestion that he viewed his family as a burden to escape. "Why would my mother lie to me?" Robert asked, anger mixing with grief in his voice. "All these years I thought he didn't want me. I thought that's why he never came back." Eleanor told him the story of the Mercy's dream about the pirate attack that claimed his father's life just weeks before Robert's birth. She explained how the letters had been lost for decades, how they had only recently been found and were finally reaching their intended recipient. "Your father didn't abandon you," she said gently. "He died trying to come home to you." Robert sank into a chair, the letter still clutched in his hands. "She was protecting me, wasn't she? My mother. She thought it would be easier for me to believe he left than to know he was dead. Perhaps she thought anger would hurt less than grief. But I grieved anyway. I grieved for a father who didn't love me enough to stay. Now I find out he loved me so much he was rushing home to meet me when he died." Eleanor watched as Robert struggled to reconcile 43 years of manufactured resentment with the truth of his father's love. The letter had given him a father's blessing, but it had also taken away the comfortable anger that had shaped his identity. "He writes about teaching me to read the stars," Robert said, his voice wondering, "about taking me on fishing trips and showing me how to tie sailors' knots. I always felt drawn to boats, to the water. My mother hated it, said it was a waste of time. Now I understand why." As Eleanor prepared to leave, Robert walked her to her car, the letter still in his hands. "Mrs. Blackwood, were there other letters, other families who never knew what really happened? Many others. I'm trying to deliver them all." "Let me help," he said suddenly. "I have a truck, and I know these coastal towns. My father died trying to get home to his family. The least I can do is help other families receive their father's final word." Eleanor accepted his offer, understanding that Robert needed to transform his newfound grief into something productive, something that would honor the father he had never known but now understood had loved him deeply. The village of Saltwind Harbor had once been a thriving fishing community, but decades of economic decline had left it a shadow of its former self. Weathered houses dotted the hillside above a harbor where only a few working boats remained, and many of the shops along Main Street stood empty, their windows covered with newspaper and for rent signs. Eleanor and Robert drove through the quiet streets, searching for the address Ezra Blackstone had given them for the family of Daniel Morse, one of the younger crew members aboard the Mercy's Dream. They found the house at the end of a dead-end street, its yard overgrown, and a condemn notice posted on the front door. "We're too late," Robert said, studying the official paperwork that declared the property unsafe for habitation. "The family's gone." Eleanor felt the weight of disappointment settling over her. Each failed delivery reminded her that time was the enemy of memory, that 43 years was perhaps too long to wait for closure. How many families had moved away, died out, or simply forgotten the men who had never come home? They walked through the village center, looking for anyone who might remember the Morse family. Most of the businesses were closed, but they found the local library still operating in a converted church, its stained glass windows casting colored light across rows of well-worn books. Helen Cartwright, the elderly librarian, looked up from her desk with the grateful expression of someone who rarely received visitors. At 85, she had the sharp memory of a person who had spent her life organizing information and helping others find what they needed. "The Morse family," she repeated, when Eleanor explained their search. "Oh my, I haven't heard that name in decades. Daniel was such a sweet boy, always checking out books about faraway places. His mother brought him here every week until he was old enough to come on his own." She led them to a corner of the library where local history books were displayed, pulling out a thick volume titled Saltwind Harbor, A Community Remembers. The book was a collection of photographs and stories compiled in the 1990s as part of a heritage preservation project. "Here," Mrs. Cartwright said, opening to a page near the middle. "Daniel Morse, lost at sea 1980. His family held a memorial service, though they never had a body to bury." The photograph showed a young man barely out of his teens, with dark hair and the earnest expression of someone eager to see the world. Beneath the picture was a brief biography. Daniel left Saltwind Harbor aboard the merchant vessel Mercy's Dream, hoping to earn enough money to marry his sweetheart, Rebecca Shaw, and start a family. He was 21 years old. "Rebecca Shaw," Eleanor repeated. "Do you know what happened to her?" Mrs. Cartwright nodded sadly. "She waited 2 years for Daniel to come home, then married Robert Shaw, no relation despite the name. They moved to Portland when the fishing industry collapsed here. Rebecca died about 10 years ago, but she had children. They might still be in the area." Eleanor felt hope rekindling. Even if Daniel's immediate family was gone, his memory lived on through the woman who had loved him and the family she had eventually built. They drove to the old cemetery on the hill above the village, where Mrs. Cartwright had told them they would find a memorial stone erected for the lost sailors. The cemetery was overgrown, many of the older headstones tilted or cracked with age. But near the center they found what they were looking for. The memorial was a simple granite stone, weathered, but still legible. "In memory of our sons lost at sea, Daniel Morse, Patrick O'Brien, James Fuller. Their bodies rest with the ocean, their souls rest with God." Eleanor knelt beside the stone, placing Daniel's letter against the granite. The letter was addressed to Rebecca, full of promises about their future together and plans for the wedding they would have when he returned. She read aloud his words of love, his excitement about the money he was earning, his dreams of building a cottage by the sea where they could raise their children. "Someone should know he kept his promises," Robert said quietly. Even if he couldn't fulfill them, he never stopped loving her. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Eleanor noticed fresh flowers at the base of the memorial, daisies and seagrass, the kind that grew wild along the coast. Someone still remembered these lost young men, still honored their sacrifice even when the village around them was dying. The discovery gave her hope that memory could survive even when communities failed, that love could endure even when the people who carried it were gone. Captain Morrison's personal effects had been stored in a maritime museum warehouse for over 4 decades, waiting for someone to claim them. The curator, a stern woman named Dr. Elizabeth Warren, led Eleanor and Robert through rows of carefully catalogued artifacts from shipwrecks and maritime disasters. "We've had these items since 1981, Dr. Warren explained, pulling out a wooden crate marked with Captain Morrison's name. "The insurance company donated them after the case was closed. No family ever came forward to claim them." Robert stared at the crate containing his father's possessions, his hands clenched at his sides. "Because no one told us he was dead," he said quietly. "My mother thought he had abandoned us." Inside the crate they found the personal belongings of a ship's captain, a sextant for navigation, brass buttons from his uniform, a pocket watch engraved with his initials, but it was the collection of hand-drawn charts that caught Eleanor's attention. The charts were works of art as much as navigation tools, showing not just coastlines and depths, but detailed notes about tides, weather patterns, and safe harbors. In the margins, Captain Morrison had written personal observations: good fishing here. Remember for retirement, sheltered cove, perfect for small boat. Elizabeth would love the sunset from this point. Elizabeth was my mother's name, Robert said, tracing his finger over his father's handwriting. He was planning their future together. Dr. Warren spread out the largest chart, showing the Caribbean islands where Captain Morrison had intended to settle. Red ink marked specific locations, with notes about property prices, climate, and opportunities for a retired sea captain to make a living. He wasn't just planning a voyage, Eleanor realized. He was planning a new life for his family. Among the charts they found a letter addressed to Elizabeth Morrison, never sent. Robert opened it with trembling hands, reading his father's words aloud. My dearest Elizabeth, by the time you read this, I will have completed my final voyage as captain of a merchant vessel. The money from this trip will be enough to buy the land in Barbados that I showed you in the photographs. Our son will grow up with warm sunshine and clean air, far from the factories and pollution of home. The letter went on to describe Captain Morrison's detailed plans for their new life. He had researched schools for their unborn child, investigated opportunities for Elizabeth to continue her work as a seamstress, even chosen the spot where he wanted to build their house. He had it all planned out, Robert said, his voice breaking. Everything he wanted to give us, everything he dreamed we could be together. Eleanor found herself thinking of her own husband, of the dreams and plans that had died with the Mercy's dream. Thomas had been just a crew member, but Captain Morrison had been responsible for everyone aboard that ship. His guilt must have been overwhelming, knowing that his decisions had led 22 men to their deaths. Warren pulled out one final item from the crate, a small wooden box containing what appeared to be wedding rings. These were intended as gifts, she explained, consulting the museum's records. The manifest shows he purchased them in port, planning to give them to his wife as an anniversary present. Robert held the rings up to the light, seeing how they had been crafted to match perfectly. His parents had been married for only 2 years when Captain Morrison died, still newlyweds looking forward to a lifetime together. I need to visit her grave, Robert said suddenly. I need to tell her that he didn't abandon us, that he was coming home with plans for our future. Even if she can't hear me, I need to say the words. They drove to the cemetery where Robert's mother was buried, a simple headstone marking her final resting place. Robert knelt beside the grave and placed his father's letter against the stone, reading aloud the words that should have reached her 43 years ago. He loved you, Mom, Robert whispered. He was coming home to you with everything he'd promised. I'm sorry you died thinking he didn't care. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor noticed that someone had left fresh flowers at the grave, roses that matched the ones Captain Morrison had mentioned wanting to plant in Barbados. When she asked the cemetery caretaker about them, he smiled sadly. Lady comes by every year on the anniversary of the ship sinking, he said. Never gives her name, just leaves flowers and stands here for a while. Been doing it for as long as I can remember. Eleanor understood. Even in a world of missed connections and lost letters, love found ways to persist, to honor memory, to keep faith with the dead. The address led them to a sprawling farmhouse surrounded by apple orchards, where 3 generations of the Sullivan family had built their lives on the land that Patrick O'Brien had dreamed of owning. Eleanor and Robert found the family matriarch, Catherine Sullivan, hanging laundry on a line that stretched between 2 ancient oak trees. At 78, Catherine moved with the steady purpose of someone who had spent decades managing both farm and family. Her grey hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands showed the honest wear of a lifetime spent in service to others. When Eleanor explained why they had come, Catherine's weathered face grew thoughtful. Patrick O'Brien, she repeated slowly. I haven't spoken that name aloud in 40 years. Come inside, both of you. This conversation requires tea and proper chairs. The farmhouse kitchen was warm and lived in, with copper pots hanging from ceiling hooks and the lingering scent of fresh baked bread. Photographs covered every available surface. Children at various ages, wedding pictures, family gatherings that spanned decades. In the center of the mantelpiece sat a small white heightening gown, carefully preserved behind glass. "That was meant for Patrick's son," Catherine said, noticing Eleanor's attention. "I made it while I was pregnant, embroidered his initials in blue thread because I was certain the baby would be a boy. Patrick never got to see either the gown or the child it was meant for." She poured tea from a china pot that had clearly seen years of service, her movements economical and graceful. "I was Catherine O'Brien then, 19 years old and married, barely 6 months, when Patrick left for what he promised would be his last voyage. We needed the money, you see. The farm was struggling, and we had debts from the wedding." Eleanor pulled Patrick's letter from her purse, noting how Catherine's eyes immediately focused on the familiar handwriting. "He wrote this for you and the baby. He never got to send it." Catherine accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or emotion, Eleanor couldn't tell. As she read, tears began to fall onto the yellowed paper, each drop absorbed by words that had waited 4 decades to reach their destination. "He knew about the baby," Catherine whispered. "I hadn't told him before he left, wanted to be certain, didn't want to worry him if I was wrong. But somehow he knew." The letter spoke of Patrick's excitement about becoming a father, his promises to return in time for the birth, his dreams of teaching his son to work the land and care for animals. He wrote about the apple trees he wanted to plant, about building a proper nursery in the farmhouse, about the love he already felt for a child he had never seen. "The baby was born 2 months after the ship was lost," Catherine continued. "A son, just as I'd predicted. I named him Patrick Michael, though he never knew his father's name came first." "Where is he now?" Robert asked gently. Catherine gestured toward the photographs on the mantelpiece. "Gone these 15 years. Cancer took him when he was 42, the same age his father was when he died at sea. But he gave me grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The O'Brien blood runs through all of them, even though they carry the Sullivan name." She stood and walked to a wooden chest near the window, pulling out a bundle of baby clothes wrapped in tissue paper. Among them was a small wooden toy boat, hand-carved and painted blue. "Patrick made this for the baby before he left," she explained. "Said every Irish boy needed a boat, even if he lived on a farm. Little Patrick played with it every day until he was old enough for real toys. Now his grandson plays with it." Eleanor watched as Catherine held the toy boat, seeing 43 years of love and loss contained in that simple gesture. "You never remarried?" "Oh, I did. Michael Sullivan was a good man, patient and kind. He adopted Patrick's son and gave us 4 more children. But I never forgot my first love, never stopped missing the life Patrick and I had planned together." Catherine walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the apple orchard that stretched toward the horizon. "Michael understood that part of my heart would always belong to Patrick. He never minded that I kept the christening gown, never complained when I would go quiet on the anniversary of the ship sinking." As Eleanor and Robert prepared to leave, Catherine pressed something into Eleanor's hand. It was a small apple, perfectly red and still warm from the afternoon sun. "From the trees Patrick dreamed of planting," she said. "He never got to see them grow, but his son planted them in his memory. Every harvest I think of the father who never came home to teach his boy about the land." The Trade Guild Hall stood in the oldest part of the harbour district, its brick facade weathered by decades of salt air, but still dignified in the way of institutions built to last. Eleanor and Robert had come seeking information about Marcus Webb, whose letter identified him as a member of the Merchant Sailors Guild and whose final words spoke of honor and duty above personal gain. Guild Secretary Harold Pembroke was a man in his 70s who had spent his entire career tracking the careers and fates of merchant sailors. His office was lined with ledgers dating back over a century, each one containing the records of men who had chosen honest trade over easier but less honorable ways of making a living. "Marcus Webb," he said, consulting a thick registry book. "One of our finest members, joined the guild in 1975 at age 26, sponsored by his father and uncle, both guild members. Never had a single complaint filed against him, never broke a contract or abandoned a ship. He showed them Marcus's membership record, complete with a photograph of a serious young man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands. The record showed steady employment aboard various merchant vessels, with commendations from captains praising his reliability and integrity. The guild was everything to men like Marcus, Pembroke explained. It wasn't just about finding work, it was about maintaining standards, ensuring that merchant sailing remained an honorable profession. Every member pledged to conduct himself with dignity, to treat cargo owners fairly, to never engage in piracy or smuggling. Eleanor read Marcus's letter again, understanding now why his final words had focused not on personal messages to family, but on his commitment to the guild's principles. He had written about refusing offers to join pirate crews, about choosing harder but honest work, about believing that commerce should build bridges between peoples rather than create victims. Was he married? Did he have family? Pembroke consulted another ledger, this one containing personal information about guild members. Never married, as far as our records show. His emergency contact was listed as his sister Margaret Webb, but that address is 40 years old. They spent the afternoon tracking down records of the Webb family, eventually finding that Margaret had married and moved to a coastal town 2 hours away. Margaret Webb Patterson was now a widow herself, living in a small cottage with a garden that overlooked the sea. When Eleanor and Robert arrived at her door, Margaret immediately recognized Marcus's name. At 75, she retained the sharp features that had marked her brother's face, along with the same direct gaze that suggested someone unafraid of hard truth. "I knew he was dead," she said simply, leading them into her living room. "When he didn't come home for Christmas 1980, I knew something terrible had happened. Marcus never broke a promise, never missed a family gathering without sending word." She showed them a bronze medallion that had belonged to their father, then their grandfather, and finally to Marcus. The trade guild emblem was worn smooth by generations of handling, its inscription barely visible: honor, integrity, service. "He was so proud of this," Margaret said, holding the medallion up to the light. "Said it represented everything our family stood for. Our grandfather started as a dock worker and earned his way into the guild through pure determination. Our father built on that reputation. Marcus was going to be the one to establish our family name permanently in guild history." Eleanor handed her Marcus's letter, watching as Margaret read her brother's final thoughts about duty and honor. The letter spoke of his pride in carrying on family traditions, his commitment to honest trade, his belief that merchants served a higher purpose by connecting distant peoples through commerce. "He writes about refusing an offer to join a smuggling operation," Margaret said, looking up from the letter. "Says he'd rather earn less money honestly than compromise the family name." "That sounds exactly like something Marcus would say." "He died defending those principles," Robert said. "The pirates attacked because the Mercy's dream was carrying legitimate cargo, running honest trade routes. Your brother died because he refused to compromise." Margaret walked to her mantelpiece and picked up a photograph of Marcus in his guild uniform, young and serious and proud. "He always said that reputation was the only thing that truly belonged to you, the only thing no one could take away. I guess he was wrong about that last part." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "His reputation survives. The guild records show what kind of man he was. This letter proves he died true to his principles. That's a legacy worth preserving." As they prepared to leave, Margaret insisted on giving Eleanor the guild medallion. "Marcus has no children to pass this to," she explained. "But you're carrying on his work in a way, delivering these letters, honoring the memory of honest men. I think he'd want you to have it." The medical college library held archives dating back to the 19th century, its quiet halls lined with portraits of physicians who had dedicated their lives to healing. Eleanor and Robert had come searching for information about Richard Pemberton, whose final letter was unlike any of the others they had delivered. While the other sailors had written to family members about love and regret, Pemberton had addressed his letter to the Dean of Maritime Medical Studies, describing in clinical detail the pirate attack and his failed attempts to save his fellow crew members. It read more like a medical report than a dying man's final words. Yet somehow that made it even more heartbreaking. Librarian Mrs. Sarah Chen led them through the archives to a section dedicated to maritime medicine, where Dr. Pemberton's contributions were prominently displayed. At 28, he had been the youngest doctor ever certified in emergency maritime medicine, specializing in treating injuries and illnesses aboard ships far from shore. Dr. Pemberton was considered brilliant, Mrs. Chen explained, pulling out academic journals containing his published research. He pioneered several techniques for treating trauma in resource-limited environments. His work saved countless lives. She showed them photographs from medical conferences where Pemberton had presented his research, a serious young man whose dedication to his profession was evident in every image. His specialty had been emergency surgery, particularly the kind of rapid intervention required when trained medical facilities were hours or days away. Why was he aboard a merchant vessel? Robert asked. Surely someone with his qualifications could have found work at established hospitals. Mrs. Chen consulted Dr. Pemberton's personnel file, finding the answer in his application letters. He believed that merchant sailors deserved the same quality of medical care as passengers on luxury ships. He spent several months each year sailing with merchant crews, providing medical services and training sailors in basic first aid. Eleanor read Dr. Pemberton's final letter again, understanding now why it focused on medical details rather than personal farewells. Even as he dying, his primary concern had been documenting what had happened so that others might learn from the tragedy. He describes Thomas's injuries, she said, reading aloud from the letter: severe lacerations from flying debris, possible concussion from impact with falling rigging, shock from witnessing the deaths of fellow crew members. He treated Thomas's wounds before helping him into the water. The letter went on to describe Dr. Pemberton's attempts to save other crew members, his frustration at being unable to perform surgery without proper instruments, his decision to use his medical kit to ease the pain of men who were beyond saving. His final sentences were a plea for better emergency medical protocols aboard merchant vessels. He saved Thomas's life, Robert realized. If Dr. Pemberton hadn't treated his injuries, your husband might not have survived long enough to be rescued. Chen led them to a display case containing Dr. Pemberton's medical kit, donated to the college by his family after his death. The leather satchel contained instruments that looked primitive by modern standards, but represented the most advanced emergency care available at sea. His parents insisted the kit be displayed here, she explained. They wanted students to understand that medicine isn't just about working in comfortable hospitals. Sometimes it's about doing whatever you can with whatever you have to save lives. Eleanor examined the instruments, imagining Dr. Pemberton using them to treat Thomas's injuries while their ship burned around them. The young doctor had chosen to spend his final moments not writing farewell letters to loved ones, but documenting medical information that might prevent future tragedies. Did he have a family? Eleanor asked. Engaged to be married, Mrs. Chen replied, consulting the file again. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, also a physician. She was waiting for him to return so they could begin their practice together. After his death, she established a scholarship in his name for students studying maritime medicine. They found Dr. Sarah Mitchell, now Dr. Sarah Hoffman, still practicing medicine at age 71, running a free clinic in the same neighborhood where she and Dr. Pemberton had planned to work together. She was a small woman with gray hair and gentle hands that spoke of decades spent healing others. Richard was the most dedicated doctor I ever knew, she said when Eleanor explained their mission. He could have made a fortune in private practice, but he insisted on serving people who couldn't afford quality medical care. Eleanor handed her Dr. Pemberton's final letter, watching as Sarah read her fiancé's last professional observations. When she finished, there were tears in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Even dying, he was thinking about how to save others, she said. That was Richard, always the doctor first, everything else second. I miss him every day, but I've tried to honor his memory by continuing the work we planned to do together. She showed them photographs of the clinic, of patients who had received care they couldn't have afforded elsewhere, of medical students who had learned that healing was about service rather than profit. Richard would be proud, Eleanor said, seeing the legacy that lived on in Doc Hoffman's work. I hope so, Sarah replied. It's what we both dreamed of, medicine as a calling, rather than just a career. In the bottom of Thomas's chest, beneath all the addressed letters, Eleanor found a bundle of correspondence that broke her heart in an entirely different way. These letters had no specific recipients, no family names or addresses. Instead, they were written to unknown readers, to anyone who might someday care enough to remember men who had died alone. The first letter began simply, "To someone who cares. My name was Timothy Walsh, and I want someone to know that I existed." There was no family to write to, no sweetheart waiting at home. Timothy had been an orphan who found family among his fellow sailors, a young man whose only legacy would be the memories of shipmates who were now dead themselves. Eleanor sat in her kitchen with Robert, both of them reading through the anonymous letters, with growing emotion. These were the voices of men who had slipped through the cracks of society, who had no one to mourn them, no one to carry their stories forward. Yet their words carried the same universal hopes and fears as the letters written to specific loved ones. "To whoever finds this," wrote a sailor named Benjamin Cross, "I never married, never had children, never did anything that would make me remembered. But I want someone to know that I tried to be a good man. I helped my shipmates when they were sick. I shared my food when others went hungry. I kept my word when I gave it. If that means anything to anyone, then maybe my life wasn't wasted." Robert wiped his eyes as he read another letter from James Murphy, a man who had run away from an abusive home at 16 and found refuge aboard merchant ships. "I know my family won't miss me," he had written. "They were probably relieved when I left, but I found brothers among the crew of the Mercy's Dream. If anyone reads this, please know that we took care of each other. We were a family, even if we weren't related by blood." Eleanor thought of Thomas, understanding now another layer of his guilt. He had survived not just the death of men with families, but the death of men who had no one else to remember them. Their stories would disappear entirely unless someone chose to preserve them. "What do we do with these?" Robert asked. "There's no one to deliver them to." Eleanor looked around her kitchen, thinking of all the families they had found, all the closure they had been able to provide. These letters represented a different kind of tragedy. Not just death, but the prospect of being forgotten entirely. "We make sure they're not forgotten," she said finally. "We find a way to honor their memory, even if they have no family to receive their words." Over the following days, Eleanor and Robert contacted local newspapers, historical societies, and maritime museums. They shared the stories of the anonymous sailors, reading their letters aloud to journalists and historians who understood the importance of preserving these voices. The response was overwhelming. Newspapers ran feature articles about the forgotten crew members of the Mercy's Dream. Museums requested copies of the letters for their archives. Genealogy societies offered to research the backgrounds of the anonymous sailors, hoping to find distant relatives or childhood friends who might remember them. Most moving of all was the response from the maritime community itself. Current sailors, retired merchant marine officers, and fishing boat captains reached out to Eleanor, expressing their gratitude that someone was honoring the memory of men who had died doing the same dangerous work they did every day. Captain Maria Santos, president of the Modern Merchant Marine Association, visited Eleanor personally to discuss creating a permanent memorial for the anonymous sailors. "These men represent thousands of sailors who have died at sea with no one to remember them," she said. "Your husband carried their voices for 40 years. Now it's our responsibility to ensure those voices are heard." Eleanor found herself becoming an advocate for forgotten maritime workers, speaking at conferences and memorial services about the importance of remembering not just the famous maritime disasters, but the individual tragedies that claimed ordinary sailors far from home. The anonymous letters had given her a new purpose, a way to transform her grief over Thomas's death into something that honored both his memory and the memory of the men whose stories he had preserved. She established a foundation dedicated to researching and memorializing merchant sailors who had died without family to remember them. Timothy Walsh existed, Eleanor would say at the beginning of each speech she gave. Benjamin Cross tried to be a good man. James Murphy found family among his shipmates. They died believing no one would remember them, but they were wrong. Their words survived. And now their stories will survive too. Robert became her partner in this work, understanding that honoring his father's memory meant honoring all the men who had died alongside him. Together they created a legacy that ensured the anonymous letters would reach the audience they were meant for. Anyone who cared enough to listen to voices from beyond the grave. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning, just as Eleanor was preparing for another trip to deliver letters. The voice on the other end belonged to Amanda Richardson, an investigative journalist from the Portland Herald, who had heard about Eleanor's mission through maritime industry contacts. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've been following your story through my sources in the shipping community," Amanda said. "I'd like to write a feature article about the letters and what you've discovered about the Mercy's Dream. This story deserves to be told to a wider audience." Eleanor felt conflicted. The letters had been private communications, intimate final words from dying men to their loved one. Making them public felt like a violation of trust. Yet she also understood that the story of the Mercy's Dream needed to be preserved for history. Amanda arrived that afternoon, a woman in her 40s with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent years uncovering hidden truths. She carried a recording device and a notebook. But she also brought something unexpected, a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1980. "This is the only coverage the Mercy's Dream received when it was lost," she explained, showing Eleanor the brief article. 2 paragraphs buried on page 7. "Merchant vessel missing at sea, 23 presumed dead." No names, no details about the families left behind, no investigation into how a pirate attack could happen in supposedly safe waters. Eleanor read the sparse article, understanding Amanda's point. The deaths of 23 men had merited less attention than a local high school basketball game, which had received front-page coverage the same day. "The maritime industry has always been invisible to the general public," Amanda continued. "People don't think about the sailors who transport the goods they buy, the risks those men take to keep international commerce flowing. When they die, it barely registers as news." Amanda interviewed Eleanor for hours, asking detailed questions about each letter, each family they had found, each story of love and loss that had emerged from Thomas's hidden chest. She was particularly interested in the anonymous letters, understanding that they represented a broader social issue. "How many other tragedies like this have been forgotten?" Amanda asked. "How many families never learned what happened to their loved one? How many sailors died believing no one would remember them?" Eleanor found herself warming to Amanda's vision of the story. This wasn't about sensationalizing private grief. It was about giving voice to people who had been silenced by death and forgotten by history. "I want to do this right," Amanda said, as she prepared to leave. "I want to honor these men's memory, not exploit their tragedy. Will you trust me to tell their story with the dignity it deserves?" Eleanor agreed, understanding that the letters had given her responsibility that extended beyond individual families. The story of the Mercy's Dream needed to be told, not just for the dead sailors, but for all the forgotten workers whose sacrifices went unrecognized. When the article appeared 2 weeks later, it occupied the entire front page of the Sunday edition, with additional pages inside containing excerpts from the letters and photographs of the families Eleanor had found. Amanda had written with sensitivity and power, creating a narrative that honored both the dead sailors and the families who had waited decades for closure. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Eleanor's phone rang constantly with calls from other families of lost sailors, from maritime historians offering assistance, from genealogists volunteering to help research the anonymous letter writers. Television producers wanted to interview her, Documentary filmmakers proposed collaborations, and maritime museums requested exhibits featuring the letters. Most surprising were the calls from other widows and children of merchant sailors, people who had their own stories of men who had vanished at sea without explanation. Eleanor realized that the Mercy's dream was not unique. It was just one tragedy among many that had been forgotten by everyone except the families left behind. "You've opened something important," Amanda told her during a follow-up interview. "This story has touched people because it represents something larger than one ship, one attack. It's about how we value human life, how we remember ordinary people who do dangerous work." Eleanor began receiving letters from strangers, people sharing their own stories of loss and remembrance. Some had lost family members in maritime accidents. Others simply wanted to express their gratitude that someone was honoring the memory of forgotten workers. A retired merchant marine captain sent her a box of letters he had collected over 40 years at sea, final messages from sailors who had died far from home. "I never knew what to do with these," he wrote, "but your story showed me that someone somewhere cares enough to make sure these voices are heard." Eleanor understood that Amanda's article had transformed her personal mission into something much larger. The story of the Mercy's dream had become a catalyst for remembering all the forgotten tragedies of the sea, all the families who had never received closure, all the sailors who had died believing they would be forgotten. The memorial service took place on a crisp October morning at the harbour, where the Mercy's dream had begun its final voyage 43 years earlier. Eleanor stood before a gathering of over 200 people, many of them families she had found through her delivery of the letters, others drawn by Amanda Richardson's article and the subsequent media coverage. The old pier had been decorated with wreaths made from seagrass and wildflowers, the kind of simple, natural arrangements that reflected the honest lives of the men being remembered. A temporary altar held photographs of the crew members, their faces young and hopeful in images taken before they understood what fate awaited them. Sarah Hartwell sat in the front row, clutching her father's wooden doll and surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known their ancestor but now understood his story. Martha Whitmore had been brought from her boarding house in a wheelchair, John's wedding ring once again on her finger after 40 years of wearing it around her neck. Robert Morrison stood near the podium, his father's navigation chart spread on a display table alongside other artifacts from the lost sailors' lives. He had become Eleanor's closest partner in organizing the memorial, understanding that honoring his father meant honoring all the men who had died with him. "We gather today not to mourn," Eleanor began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "but to celebrate lives that mattered, to give voice to words that waited 43 years to be heard, and to ensure that these good men are never forgotten again." She read excerpts from the letters, sharing the hopes and dreams of men who had died too young, too far from home. Each reading brought tears from the families present, but also smiles of recognition as they heard their loved ones' voices speaking across the decades. When Eleanor read from the anonymous letters, the crowd fell into profound silence. These were the voices of men who had died believing no one would remember them, yet here were hundreds of people gathered specifically to honor their memory. "Timothy Walsh wanted someone to know he existed," Eleanor said, holding up his letter. "Benjamin Cross hoped someone would remember that he tried to be a good man. James Murphy wanted people to know that the crew of the Mercy's dream was a family, bound not by blood but by loyalty and love." Captain Maria Santos stepped forward to dedicate a permanent memorial plaque that would be installed at the harbor. The bronze plaque bore the names of all 23 men who had died aboard the Mercy's dream, along with an inscription: "They sailed seeking better lives for their families. They died as heroes protecting each other to the end. Their voices, carried home by a survivor's love, will never be silenced." The most moving moment came when the families began reading their own tributes. Sarah Hartwell spoke about the father she had barely known, but now understood completely. Robert Morrison shared stories about the mother who had raised him alone, carrying the weight of false blame for 40 years. Catherine Sullivan's grandchildren read from Patrick O'Brien's letter, Ned's words of love finally reaching the family he had dreamed of providing for. Even Martha Whitmore, despite her advanced age and failing health, insisted on speaking. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried the authority of someone who had lived long enough to understand the true value of love and memory. "John was my husband for only 5 years," she said, "but he was the love of my lifetime. I spent 43 years wondering if he had thought of me at the end, if he had died knowing how much I loved him. Now I know that he did." His letter proves that love survives even death, that some promises can be kept even by voices from the grave. As the formal ceremony concluded, people began sharing their own stories. Elderly sailors told tales of close calls and narrow escapes. Widows of other lost seamen found comfort in meeting others who understood their grief. Children and grandchildren of the dead crew members discovered connections that would last long beyond this single day. Eleanor watched as strangers became friends, united by shared understanding of loss and love. The memorial service had become more than a remembrance of the Mercy's dream. It had become a celebration of the enduring power of human connection, of the words we leave behind, of the love that survives even when we cannot. As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor noticed that many people left flowers, photographs and small mementos at the base of the memorial. The pier was transformed into an informal shrine, a place where the living could commune with the dead, where memory could be preserved and honored. The service had accomplished what Eleanor had hoped for. It had given the dead sailors the recognition they deserved, and the families the closure they had needed. But more than that, it had created a community of people committed to ensuring that such sacrifices would never again be forgotten. Spring returned to Eleanor's cottage with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness. 6 months had passed since the memorial service, and the garden behind her house had been transformed into something Thomas never could have imagined. Where once vegetables and herbs had grown in practical rows, now flowers bloomed in deliberate abundance, each variety chosen to honor one of the lost sailors of the Mercy's dream. Eleanor knelt among the daffodils she had planted for William Hartwell, their bright faces turned toward the morning sun like the hope he had carried for his daughter's future. Nearby, John Whitmore's roses climbed a trellis Thomas had built years ago, their blooms the same deep red as the love that had sustained Martha through 4 decades of solitude. The memorial garden had grown organically, with families contributing plants and stones that held meaning for their lost loved ones. Sarah Hartwell had brought bulbs from her father's favorite flowers, while Robert Morrison had installed a small fountain using stones from the coast where his father had planned to build their new home.